I have another quote by Dr. Reeves, and it's a little bit long one, so I'll just read it. He said that traditions such as Targum, Pseudo Jonathan, Deuteronomy 3:11, which I'll read very soon, affect an equation between King Og's Rephaim and the giants of antediluvian lore, and explain that King Og was the sole survivor of the giants who perished in the waters of the flood during the time of Noah. Now, Targum Pseudo Jonathan is a Western Targum or translation of the Torah, so the first five books of the Old Testament, from the land of Israel. It was composed in Israel between 150 and 250 of Common Era. And this is the quotation that actually comes from Targum Jonathan on Deuteronomy 3:11. It says, "For only Og, king of Methnan, remained of the remnant of the giants who perished in the deluge. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Behold, it is placed in the archive house in Rabbath, of the Beni Ammon, 9 cubits in its length, 4 cubits its breadth, in the cubit of its own stature." So once when we well first we hear what Targum Jonathan says when it comes to Deuteronomy 3:11, and then we see someone who is credible like Dr. John Reeves and who speaks about King Og being mentioned as Rephaim and all these things as the context. How is this helping? I don't know if I can say our case, but also helping the material that we are learning from your book.
It's an interesting one. The Targum's interesting because they take these biblical stories and expand on them and explore them. With these kind of things, there's always a bit of a blur between the historicity of these expansions and the didactic purpose of the text, right? So, in other words, they're expanding on the literature for teaching purposes rather than adding extra historical detail. It's true that there was a tradition that Og of Bashan was one of the original giants from before the flood. That probably derives from the expression last of the Rephaim. And it shows that there is a definite connection between the Nephilim and the Rephaim because the word Nephilim is not used in Deuteronomy, nor is Rephaim used in Genesis 6. That idea of identifying the same group with different names proves that in the mind of ancient scribes there was a definite connection, and it was assumed that the same group was being referred to. You don't necessarily have that concrete textual link. It's a thematic connection and it exists in the minds of the audience because they know these stories. Now, the Targum expands on the material from Deuteronomy in telling us that Og had a physical size proportionate to the bed that's described in Deuteronomy. You don't get that from the text of the Bible, but you do get that if you consider that he was known as a giant, so it follows logically. But I should point out that the dimensions given for the bed were not intended to convey any particular messaging about the physical size of Og of Bashan. The dimensions of that bed actually correspond to another bed used in cultic ritual, which was described in a text uncovered from ancient Mesopotamia known as the Isa Gila tablet. And I'll give you a short quote from my book, actually, because I talk about this. This is just a brief quote from the book and the purpose of that bed. All right, so here's the quote. This is particularly in the context of ritual lovemaking, where the bed is decorated and adorned with flowers, spices, and fragrances. The biblical use of this term describes the beloved in the Song of Solomon 5, verse 13. Taking this usage of the word tower, we can also see a correlation to the pagan use of ritual lovemaking beds. These were found in temples where the royalty used them for the purpose of interacting with the deities. This interaction was achieved by a temple prostitute, literally a living idol. The most famous of these beds is that of Marduk of Babylon, described in line 34 of the ancient Isagila tablet from Mesopotamia as being 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits wide, or roughly 13.5 feet by 6 feet. That's a big bed. Now, that's the end of the quote. So the idea behind mentioning the bed isn't anything to do with the size of the thing, but it was everything to do with the kind of rituals that the king was involved with, and these are connected in the Jewish mind to the origin of the giants, in particular the post-flood giants. So yeah, that's what the bed's about. A lot of people just sort of jump to, well, he needed a big bed because he was a big guy. But specifically, we've got a textual connection to the ritual practices of the Mesopotamians, This was introduced to Babylon by the Amorites, and of course, Og of Bashan, uh, and all his ilk fall into the broad category of Amorites in and around the land of Canaan. So that's where the connection lay. So the idea of uh, Moses mentioning the size of the bed in Deuteronomy is to bring it back to that idea of, this is the bad stuff that the Amorites introduced to Babylon, and which from there uh, proliferated back through uh, Canaan and the surrounds, with the result that we had these pockets of giant clans uh, coming up all through the hill country uh, outside Israel and along the northern border of Israel as well.
As much as I love all these amazing stories and fables, and including giants, I think it would not be fair. It would be even less academic and scholarly if we would assume just because the bed was huge that was inevitably the size of King Og. Because I remember at one point of my life, I mean, I was single and still sleeping in king size bed. Now that bed was like could fit 4 people like me. Imagine if someone would come and not see me, but come in my apartment and see the bed. I
Yeah,
mean, it's so easy to assume, oh, this guy who lives here must be huge, and
yeah.
I'm not, right? Uh, so I'm just trying to make those fair parallels and trying to be intellectually honest, even though I would love that to be a solid evidence that King Og was a giant. Like you said, that's not necessarily true because, I mean, the size of his bed doesn't necessarily mean that he was. I mean, maybe he was big, but not that huge, right?
Well, I'm just going to say, why do you think they call it a king size bed? But let's not go there. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.